Hi.
Hello.
Last time we read the second parable in Matthew 13, the one about the wheat and the weeds. And we left off with the question of, if you only had that parable, what would you think, or what would you expect the church to look like?
And with that question goes, what would you expect this thing we call Christendom to look like for the succeeding centuries after the apostles and Christ?
Right. So
the complication that's here is in the first parable, which we won't talk about in comparison yet, but only to make the point that in the first parable we had good seed, but in this parable we have good seed and bad seed.
Right. Growing together.
Growing together. And I guess the point that jumps out at you is, what is the judgment of the servants, the faithful servants of the master, and what's the judgment of the master himself as to what we should do about the situation of bad seed and good seed growing side by side.
Yeah. The servants think, well, we'll go in, we'll take out the weeds, and you know, that'll be good for the wheat. But he says no, don't do that. So he has a judgment that they're not going to be able to tell which is wheat and which is weed. And I'll tell you, I'm gardening. When I first plant, I let it all grow because it's true. You don't know absolutely for sure sometimes if you're pulling up the wrong thing. So leave them alone, and then when you start to see which one is the true plant that you planted.
One of the complications here is that you can get the wrong idea just by the word weed, because if you look in the original Greek, the word here is the word rendered darnel. Darnel is not just a weed, it's a weed that looks exactly like wheat.
Yeah.
Until later in the year, when the darnel starts to take on one appearance and the wheat starts to take on another,
yeah.
and the wheat bears fruit.
But even then, I think they look very similar. What they, from what I remember reading, was that the wheat gets heavier. It's heavier than darnel, and so it starts to bend, and that's when they know which one is the bad and which is the good.
Which is giving extra force to the wait until the harvest.
Yeah.
Let them grow together until the harvest. Then you will see. Right. And now here's where it gets complicated for Jehovah's Witnesses and other what we might call restoration groups.
Right, because the Watchtower has conditioned us to always think we're in the last days, and to think time-related stuff. That's been the whole history of the Watchtower, is you're living in the last days. And so they'd be pulling out way before it actually is the time of the end.
The last days is unfortunately confused with the harvest time.
Right.
There is a harvest time in this parable. And there will be a harvest time when Christ judges. Right. That's for sure. All of his teachings give us that impression.
Right.
But the last days began with the coming of Christ the first time. So because we don't make that clear distinction, we end up in what we call restoration groups. We've done a whole video series that many of you will not have seen, and two of them actually. The last one was called Destructive Religious Groups, but before we did the one on destructive religious groups, we did one called Five Characteristics
of Cults.
Of Cultic Groups, and that one has one of the 5 characteristics is that they all have this concept of restoration. The Christendom became apostate, and we are restoring the true faith.
Right.
So if you believe that, then you'll be very much into separating. You'll be separating from somebody, and you'll be wanting to separate even within yourselves to make sure that you have the pure Christian teaching and you have the pure Christian faith, and that involves judging fellow Christians.
Right.
So I wanted to read to you from Alfred Plummer. It's his exegetical commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. Plummer, by the way, is one of the greatest of all commentators. He wrote commentaries on all 4 Gospels, and also on Corinthians.
One of your favorites.
One of my favorites, and he's been around for 100 years. He's proved his worth. Here's what he says about this tendency, and which he thinks is the main point of the parable. The tendency to separate and the tendency to judge among believers. Plummer says there are always persons who are ready to propose drastic remedies for real or supposed evils, and it is with regard to them that the main lesson of the parable is given. Men are not to anticipate the judgment of God, for they will do much more harm than good by attempting to do so. They have not sufficient knowledge. They do not always know how to distinguish the bad from the good, nor do they know how the removal of the bad may affect the good. A plant that will turn out very well may easily be mistaken for a weed, and the lives of good and bad are often so closely intertwined that the violent removal of the one is sure to cause injury to the other. That the bad may become good is not taught by the parable, but it is provided for in the absolute prohibition to root up any. It is not for man to call down fire from heaven upon those whom he regards as the enemies of Christ. So in the next segment we want to overlay, as it were, this parable upon the other, the first parable, and see if that helps us to see what the inevitable future of both church and Christendom will be.
Right.